Can you use a painting as a memory palace? Well, the short answer is yes, but if you do it wrong, you will just confuse your brain. Take this creature. On the back of crowded houses, dreamers are waiting. To a casual observer, it's maybe a kangaroo or a rabbit. I think here on the front, it's definitely a rabbit meeting another rabbit. To a mnemonist, however, it's not any old rabbit. It's a magnetic trigger, and it can be used in different ways. So, for example, if you have a bunch of paintings in your mind or art from album covers, you have a series of references that you can draw from. For example, there was a quote that I wanted to memorize from Alice in Wonderland, and that album came to mind because that rabbit allows me to not have to develop a new memory palace. I can just place Alice right in the painting, pulling the rabbit's ears. Literally, the painting helps do the heavy lifting of the memorization. And if you really feel imaginative, one thing you could do is take buildings inside of paintings and then imagine what the insides of those buildings are like and use paintings as memory palaces inside of memory palaces. It doesn't have to be buildings in paintings either. If we take Moons of Darwin from Christian Bök, this is one of many entries in the series, we could use the moon and make the moon have several quadrants. And it's really up to you how deep into the weeds you want to go, but I would just think top, middle, bottom, and then maybe a variation could be the cardinal directions, northeast, southwest, etc. And you could use the four corners of the piece of art. And it's really up to you how you want to design it. And of course, you can have these pieces of art inside of standard memory palaces, and you're using architecture inside of architecture, so the frame can be a number of stations inside of a standard memory palace, and then inside the image you can have an additional number of stations. So it's architecture within architecture within architecture. The issue that you face, however, is the same as you would face with any memory palace. If you're trying to develop the memory palace at the same time as you're using the memory palace, you're giving yourself two tasks at the same time, if not more than two tasks, which creates more cognitive load. So one of the problems that I find with using paintings is that if it's not super familiar or super simple, then it almost needs to be memorized first. And that's not really what the memory palace technique is all about. Think about the name of the technique. It has the word memory in it for a reason. You choose the location because it's already in your memory. It's not something you memorized. It's something that part of your mind automatically consumed and set into place through the miracle of spatial memory. So, if you're picking some kind of piece of art, try to pick one where you also have a very, very solid image already in memory. Mona Lisa would be a great example. Most of us know this cold. But if we were thinking about the Last Supper, how many of us actually know the number of disciples? Now, you might have a religious background and just name it immediately and be absolutely correct. But some of us will be like, what was it, 7? Was it 11? Was it 12? Did we count Jesus? Like, how does it all work, right? And if you have any questions like that, then it's not really a memory palace, because a memory palace is a mental tool that you base on locations or spaces that are already in your memory. Otherwise, you're talking about a memorized palace. Nothing wrong with it, but you should know this issue, and you just got to own it if that's what you're going to do. And believe me, I've owned it, and it hurts every single time. I much prefer to make sure that the images are super simple. In other words, this is one of my favorite paintings ever, but I would not use it as a memory palace. There's way too much going on. I'd have to memorize something about it in order to use it. Now you could say, come on, make it simple, just take this one little figure here. But that figure, even though he could be divided into top, middle, bottom of his body, or use the 10-station body memory palace technique, it's still just overwhelmed with so much going on that it distracts from the simplicity of the task. at least for me. Your mileage may be different. There's another consideration that may or may not be relevant to you. I know my friend Nelson Dulles, he told me one time on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, this kind of stuff doesn't bother him at all. He's a memory competitor. He wants to win. But the art that's inside of this little art container, it really bugs me. Now, before I open it up and discuss what's inside that bothers me so much that I would never use this piece of art as a memory palace, if you're new here, get subscribed if you want more details about various ways to use all of the memory techniques that I continually research and practice with myself. And for the love of memory, hit thumbs up. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from MagneticMemoryMethod.com, and let's see what on earth scares the bejesus out of me to the point that I would never use this ever, amen. And I'm exaggerating the infinity here because, well, you'll see. The art in the tube depicts Giordano Bruno, who was studied in this book by Francis Yates. This is an extraordinarily beautiful edition, and I just can't believe that I have this in my hands. I don't even know if it's available anymore, but Gallo Glass Books was kind enough to send it to me, and there's a previous video where I did a review of it if you want to check that out. It itself is filled with art. And this picture I could imagine using as a memory palace, really just the top, the middle, and the bottom. But the tube, here's what I mean. Giordano Bruno was famous for his memory, but he was more famous for being burned at the stake. Now, as much as this really surrenders itself to use as a body memory palace, because you can put all of the 10 stations of the standard body memory palace on the figure of Giordano Bruno, the last thing I want to be thinking about when I'm memorizing using a piece of art is the death of one of the most legendary memory experts ever to live. You know, it's kind of obvious when you think about it. You just got to pick your battles, basically. And so if you're going to use art, remember that the themes can affect you emotionally, and that may interfere with the task. But otherwise, it is very nice. And by the way, when I talk about the body memory palace technique and the 10 elements that you would place on that body, I cover this in depth in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. But Bruno himself used 30 stations, not 10. And I've simplified it because 30 is just a lot. And basically what he did is he had his 2 eyes, the 2 nostrils, which is way too small for my taste, the 2 lips, the 2 cheeks, etc. And he just basically had 15 stations, but every part of the body that is doubled, ears, hands, etc. And it's just a really, really fascinating and powerful technique that I suggest that you explore. And essentially what it does is it opens you up to using all kinds of figure paintings, as long as they don't freak you out, because burning at the stake can't be nice. Now have a little gander at this illustration of a television set with a chain wrapped around it in the shape of an X. What might that have to do with using art as a memory palace? Well, part of it has to do with a bonus that comes with my second memory detective novel, Vitamin X, which you might notice has a building on the cover into which you might imagine your own memory palace. Oh, how the labyrinth extends itself in the magnetic memory method world. There's actually a couple of pieces of art in here, one of which is quite famous, and you'll have opportunities to think about how to use that as a memory palace, in this particular case, in a two-world syndrome sense, which will be unfolded for those who get Vitamin X and the bonuses that go with it. The point is that you can use art in all kinds of ways, and you should really, really experiment with it. Every piece of art is essentially a window, and anywhere that you have a window, you can enter information through it. And you can have windows inside of windows, which is essentially what a stained glass window is, and there's just wonderful, wonderful opportunities that essentially build journeys for you. You just have to identify the journey and ideally make sure that it's already in your memory so that you don't have to think about it. You can just pick up that image and then allow yourself to navigate it. And the easier you make it on yourself, the better. But constantly exposing yourself to art is a beautiful, beautiful strategy. Now, I mentioned Christian Bök's project with the moons of Darwin. That's a very, very simple, although it's very beautiful art. Let's take things to a complicated level that's almost God tier when it comes to art. The lady in gold among the almonds, as represented here on my phone, I actually own this piece of art. This is part of a much larger project that I'm working on where you will be able to enter a physical memory palace, and then this piece of art will be inside of it, which is very, very wonderful. And I hope you will come and visit this physical memory palace I'm developing, and I hope I'll actually be able to pull it off. There's been some complexities, but part of the idea is to have this puzzle art inside of the physical memory palace to help teach a concept that I've been working on for much, much more complex information. Because sometimes, let's face it, you have things that you want to memorize that are more complicated than a cartoon rabbit is going to allow for, or 3 stations on the Mona Lisa is going to enable you to do. What if you're memorizing philosophy, or foreign language grammatical principles, or advanced medical terminology? Then you need something denser. And this puzzle art is going to help with that, I believe. And so you have to just imagine right now what that might be about. And if you're thinking, oh, well, it's like each piece is going to be a station in a memory palace. No, that's not it. That would be way, I think, too complex. Although it is an interesting idea, especially if you know the number of pieces. No, unlike this album cover with its beautiful art and the houses and the simple figures, this gives you a limited amount. But what I see possible in Christian Bök's art is fractal density. And we're going to need to do more conceptual exploration of what our memory can be stretched to do based on assigning things we want to memorize in space. Because the chatbots are producing more and more and more, and we have to keep up with it somehow. And I have a feeling that maybe we can. There's going to be a specific chaos. I mean, it's already here, right? And we're going to need to find the order inside of it. So I find the art that Christian Bök does and other things that he does in literature really interesting for using your mind to think more conceptually and then push. And he certainly has pushed things with things like his Xenotext project, where poetry has, to simplify things, been injected into deathless bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans. And so basically what I'm suggesting to you now is to get more involved in art. I think a lot about Neil Postman. He had a book called Amusing Yourself to Death, I think it was called. What if we amuse ourselves to life? You know, art is so wonderful. And today we've really talked about the art of memory literally in the sense of applying the ancient idea of the memory palace to actual instances of art. But I suggest that you start to think about the use of texture, of color, not just the frame, as a means of retention. And one of the textures and colors that I think is missing from contemporary practice in memory is the idea of the concept. And so when we think back to Giordano Bruno and his use of the Lullian memory wheels and other things that he talked about, we have missed so much of that. And yes, it's hard to understand, and it's hard to imagine exactly how it's all going to work out. And, you know, there's a speculative nature to the mnemonics that are explored in my memory detective fiction, but all towards the idea of actually engaging with the art of memory as an art, which is why I started to write magnetic fiction. So it will help you practically, but there's also a conceptual level that I think will help you conceptually, which will then serve you practically. So when I use art as a memory palace, Basically, what I do is try to make sure that the art has entered my memory without memorizing it. This is a very, very key principle of all the memory palaces I use. So I've shown you some art today. One of them had a moon on it. That should be quite simple for you to just simply know what it was, and then you can use it. You have the 4 corners of the frame and the 4 edges of the frame, which could give you 8 stations. And then you have the moon. It's not exactly central, but you can start to think about all the textures that you may have seen there and use them as ripples and maybe divide those ripples in certain ways to add more numbers. I wouldn't do that, though, myself. I would just keep it simple. I love to look at it, but if I just think about the residue left in my mind, it's basically 4 corners of the frame and a white dot, and that gives 5 stations very, very simply, very easily. If I want to push it to the next level, well, on the moon there is a crater, I think it is, called Giordano Bruno, and so I could now have the cardinal directions of the moon, north, south, east, west, and then I could have the cardinal directions of this hole in the moon named after Giordano Bruno, and that now has the 4 directions and so forth. The key, though, to using all of that is that it doesn't put additional cognitive load on my brain, because I just am recognizing the patterns that were deeply imprinted through interest in the art and in the scientific facts, or the astronomical facts in this case. I guess you would call them astronomical facts if this crater really exists on the moon. It's a pattern recognition, basically, is what I'm trying to suggest. A pattern that's already woven. So, can you use art and paintings in memory palaces? Absolutely. But when you are using them to help you encode data, you don't want to be solving visual puzzles while you're doing it. That's making your brain work harder than necessary. And the harder you have to fight to establish the memory in the first place, the less useful the memory palace technique is overall. So, with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for your thumbs up. Thanks for all your wonderful comments, and thanks for being subscribed. If you want to carry on in this speculative mnemonic realm and think about something else that I've done, which is even more abstract, watch my video on the secrets of the geometrical memory palace technique next.